Welcome to the Science of Creativity. I'm Keith Sawyer, and today I'm going to be interviewing Dr. Aaron Kozbelt. Aaron Kozbelt is a professor at Brooklyn College in New York City. He's a psychologist, and he's studied, seems like, almost everything about creativity when you look at his CV and his website. So now, here's our interview with Dr. Aaron Kozbelt. Well, I'm here with Dr. Aaron Kozbelt. He's a professor at Brooklyn College, the City University of New York. Aaron, it's great to have you on the Science of Creativity.
Delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you've done so many different things with creativity. You were one of those, Renaissance researchers. You've studied music, painting, neuroscience. But tell me something about your own creativity. You've spent 20 years as a visual artist. Tell me about that.
Right. Well, I think that interest in art is really probably what got me into this in the first place. When I went off to college, I didn't quite know what I wanted to study. I had this sense that I was interested in psychology, but didn't really know what that meant in modern terms. But I'd spent an awful lot of time drawing and painting and being involved in classical music and things like that. And so when I learned that, hey, maybe there were methodologies within psychology that could be applied to understanding things like aesthetics or creativity, that was very appealing because I never really wanted to have to rely on painting, let's say, to make a living. And there were lots of people doing that anyway, or trying to do it. And so I thought, well, if I can be one of the ones to understand what's going on inside a person's head when they are being creative, that would be really cool too. And so that set me off. I continued, doing lots of, creative stuff. I mean, this is, a piece I did in grad school behind me. And it was really an excuse to, ask questions about the nature of creativity. Why was I doing it this way? Was this thing that I just did that make it better or worse? How do I know when something's done? Basic kind of in the studio nuts and bolts kind of questions that maybe wouldn't have occurred to me if I were just approaching it from a theoretical point of view. And so I think the practical experience of just trying to make something that was interesting has really driven a lot of my research agenda, even to the extent, early on where it's like, I want to ask questions about creativity such that if I get an answer, that information would make me better at making art. And it's sort of, blossomed in a lot of different directions since then. But there was always that pragmatic focus on making and the creative process and how to understand it more broadly.
Well, I've known about your work for a long time because we've both been doing this research for decades. And I've been reading some of your articles just to prepare for this interview. And I know you've done studies of visual creativity, some of them about drawing and illustration. So can you say a little bit about that? How would you study visual creativity?
So I think I've always had a bias to be interested in high level creativity and complex manifestations of creativity, not just, these kind of, there are plenty of people who study aspects of creative thought very much in the lab, but very much with a non-expert population on, domain general tasks like divergent thinking or alternative uses. And those are fine if you want to understand certain aspects of creativity, but those aren't the aspects that I was most interested in. I was always concerned about much more high level stuff. And so work like by Mike Csikszentmihalyi in his dissertation way back in the day, done observing student artists at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, I followed up with my own dissertation looking at the same kind of question. When you have people that have made a career commitment to visual art and you present them with a pretty open-ended problem situation and ask them to make something that's creative, what do they do about that? How do they structure their behavior? How do they work and rework and revise and rethink as they go? How do they decide when something is done? And I think the upshot of a lot of that was that if I observed someone and they had a really interesting, unusual creative process that was just, different in how they structured their behavior, that was associated with more interesting creative products. And so I became very interested in this connection between not just creative ideas, because I think those are overrated, but what do you do with any ideas that you have, or what do you do just to engage in activity to provoke ideas or to provoke a sense of what the next move is? And so, working that way toward a broader conceptualization that really tries to take into account and respect the full complexities of the creative process, that's a very important strand in my research. And like I said, it's not the kind of thing that is common to do or easy to do either. So I think there are good reasons why many researchers don't focus on that. But, if I'm being completely honest, I think that's where the action is. And that's what makes this topic so interesting to study and so worthwhile to just always keep looking for something else to learn.
My own research, I've always focused on the process as well. The creative process, to me, more interesting than, let's say, the single moment of having an idea or having a creative insight. So what does that look like with visual art? If you say that an artist doesn't start with an idea, then how does an artist work? Yourself, or I guess your own research? What did you find out?
So I think there's one way to spin it is the difference between deciding what to paint versus how to paint it. And I think a lot of ideas boil down to, what kinds of questions, what's the subject matter going to be, what's the concept that I'm trying to convey. And much of the time, the execution can be fairly perfunctory. And so I think there's this stereotype that goes way beyond visual art that is rooted in the idea of, if you ask someone, what do you need to do to be creative? You need a good new idea is kind of the answer. That's the starting point. Ideas as a unit of analysis in basic creativity research, and just the way that people talk about it in general. Ideas are the currency of creative thought. And there are plenty of times when I would begin a piece and, only have the vaguest sense of what I was doing. I might have, a little, embryonic notion of what I wanted to do here or in the other place. And it wasn't so much about being driven by an overarching guiding idea, but rather letting lots of ideas learn to play together and to maybe get along, maybe to get into conflict, and to guide the evolution of that in ways that led to interesting outcomes. And so part of the challenge, I think, in trying to understand how the creative process works is that if you, as you point out, don't have an initial idea and have to worry then about, well, how does something come to be if you are starting with nothing? I think the answer is that the process itself can give rise to interesting outcomes. And by that, I mean that if the usual approach is I have an idea and then I execute it in some way that is sort of standard for the discipline at the time, that if you begin without an idea and simply do things with the organization of the steps of getting something done, make it a little longer, move things around, something you would do later, do early, restructure the creative process, that in itself is a very powerful way to create surprise and novelty and to go in unanticipated directions. And when I look at something like the history of European painting, let's say, there are plenty of instances of artists who approach art making that way. And their work is really interesting to look at. Cezanne paints a couple of apples on a table. Well, who cares? It's not the what that matters for him, it's the how. And he is, doing all kinds of things to restructure the creative process. And so, for this kind of enterprise to make sense, to think about what does restructuring mean, you have to have some default baseline. And so even just, an understanding of, well, how does an artist typically approach the problem of making an image? That's valuable information in its own right. And so I think there's a lot of interesting work that can be done on these questions of restructuring the process as itself a mechanism to generate creative outcomes. And I think that there are interesting links to things like embryological development in organisms, where you get a lot of the same features arising. Small changes in the timing of development lead to radically different outcomes. So I think this is a powerful hook into understanding an aspect of creativity that has gone almost completely unnoticed. But I think there are interesting connections in the air for something like that.
Right. When you say restructuring the process, do you mean restructuring your mind to come up with new conceptual arrangements and combinations, or do you mean you're actually restructuring the way that you work?
Mostly, I mean restructuring the way that you work. I think there's plenty of research, again, mostly focused on ideation within the creative process, about how certain kinds of sudden changes in representation, conceptualization, moments of insight, that sort of thing, can reframe a problem and, influence what is seen as important. But I think when I'm talking, I mean something quite different, which is changing up the structure itself.
Right. But so let's say you have a structure that you're using that's really good, but you don't need to restructure it. Or is it I'm thinking of a process of learning, or maybe it's just that you mix it up. You do one thing for a while and then you restructure and then you try something else. Is that it?
Yeah, and I think this can play out on several different time scales. So one time scale is the emergence of one particular artwork, let's say, and there are different ways to restructure those sort of micro processes that lead to a particular outcome. And I think the creative because the creative process, A, is nonlinear anyway, but B, is really sensitive to small changes. If normally proceed by doing A, then B, then C, then D, and then you do then you do D, and then B, and then C, and then A, those will have ripple effects in the way that the work unfolds. It may prompt different directions. Simply the effects of the materials, if we're talking about painting, can be different. And I think there's a lot of unpredictability there. And so just by changing things around in that way, novelty can arise. There's also, though, the question of, or the timescale of an individual artist's overall trajectory over their lifespan. And this is another topic that I've been keenly interested in part because it's a very natural way to think about the human experience. You're young, and then you get older, and then that's it. And what is striking is that there are differences in the creative trajectories of different kinds of artists and creators in lots of fields. And a lot of these ideas go back to David Galenson, an economist who proposed a theory of creativity along these lines, where, some creators he calls, finders or conceptual innovators. These are the idea people who come up with some different way of looking at problems in their domain. They're very confident about what they do. They maybe change styles, pretty frequently in these discrete periods. As opposed to this other group who they are much more experimental. They don't really know what they're doing. These are exactly the kind of artists that I think shake up their own creative process as a way of generating, not high novelty, high quality products. And what's really interesting to me is that these are exactly the artists who seem to do their best work later in life. So there's something about relying on ideas and not worrying so much about execution that seems to have a shorter half-life. It's riskier. If you hit the jackpot with an idea that catches on, then you've made your reputation. If you're playing the long game and aren't worried so much about, being trendy and novel at all costs, but I just want to do good work and I'm going to explore the creative process and shake it up in some interesting ways, then those are the artists who get better. It seems like there's something about that approach that creates opportunities either for learning about the creative process or more accurate evaluation of their work. Is this getting better or worse? A sense of wisdom maybe that goes along with that. It seems to be a rather different mode of creativity. And so I'm interested in this question of how a creator changes over the course of their lifespan, whether they are, evolving a style kind of continuously throughout, or if they are making, much more abrupt changes in what they do as they go. And again, I think there's a lot of interesting questions there to be explored. So those are two
Oh,
time scales that we can deal with.
right, right. You mean the short creative process and then the entire lifespan creative process, right?
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting to think of a creative process, extending over the course of an entire life. I think I hadn't thought of this till just now, but normally it's just this one work that I'm doing, as opposed to viewing one's life as a work of art in a sense, and it having meaning and trajectory and coherence and being interesting all the way through, hopefully.
I know that book, David Gellinson, and so tell me if I'm remembering it right. So he actually does compare Cezanne and Picasso, and he says there's one type of working where over the course of your life, you'll get better and better at one type of thing. And the way he measures that is he measures the value of the paintings at auction, given the age of the artist. And then Cezanne's paintings get more and more valuable as he gets older. And then Picasso has a different working style where he's always changing what he does and he's experimenting and he
Right.
doesn't keep doing the same thing. And for a person like that, their paintings sell for more earlier in their career. That was a long time ago I read it, but that's pretty fascinating. He has this graph going up for Cezanne and it's going down for Picasso. And,
Right, right, exactly. And
so
ironically, they both do their most notable work within, almost the same calendar year. Like Cezanne does his best stuff the year he dies in 1906. Picasso's, big takeoff happens in, the following year, 1907. And I should point out that it's not just the auction prices. Like that's a convenient, I mean, he's an economist,
right, right.
Galenson. So, of course, money is useful that way. But, if you look at things like citations, frequency of reproduction in art history books, they largely tell the same story. And it's really staggering if you, dig into metrics like that, how concentrated the impactful part of many creators' careers are, creators of the arts in particular. Even if you're making a splash, it is pretty rare for that splash to go more than a few years. Typically, there's maybe 1 5-year period where an artist is really hot. They make an impact on art history, and so the fact that you have some artists who maintain creative longevity much, much longer than that is, again, I think, really interesting, both in its own right, but also, for a larger model of creative sustainability. So we talked about, the time scale of the individual work, the time scale of the person, but you can also go one better than that and talk about the time scale of an artistic tradition or, an organized society in some way. And are there ways of, being creative that make a difference on whether society burns out or figures out a way to keep going? And I think that's a particular challenge now, given the rapid rate of change in so many areas of life. You got to wonder, where is all this going? And so I think the difference between these two categories of artists can actually be construed in ways that have much bigger ramifications for thinking through all kinds of problems.
I wanted to ask again about this notion of one of your papers actually is called Learning to See, Learning to See by Learning to Draw. And just last year, I published a book called Learning to See. So that, popped out for me. And it's
Yeah,
published in the Psychology of Aesthetics, Creativity, and the Arts, which is one of our top journals. We call it PACA or PACA.
right.
So, would you be willing to talk about that a little bit? What do you mean learning to see by learning to draw?
So I'll zoom out a little bit because this is part of a long body of work that I was involved with, spanning a couple decades. So my interest in art, my early interest in art, initially took two forms. One was the creative process, which we've already discussed, but another one was perceptual differences that might go along with having lots of experience in art. And so there's, scattered in the art historical and art critical literature going back, there is this notion that if you learn to draw, you spend a lot of time looking carefully at the world with the intention of reproducing what you see, that some aspects of the functioning of your visual system, your visual cognition, those will change over time. And this isn't a crazy idea in the sense that, people talk about cultural differences in very similar ways. Just the kind of experience you and your brain endure for years, it would be shocking if, it didn't have an impact. Now, I think the question of vision is interesting because we are such preeminently visual creatures. You might think that we are essentially maxed out, that the way we engage visually with the world is already functioning at such a high level just for survival needs. Where could you possibly go from there? And so what I was interested in finding out was whether you could document changes in perception that were associated with experience in drawing. And perception is tricky here because it can mean lots of different things. I mean, it can mean, the sense of a creative vision. I mean, that's, Getzels and Csikszentmihalyi's right. book, and that has more to do maybe with, intuiting possibility within a particular artistic, let's say, situation. But there's a more sort of hard-nosed aspect, which is, look, you can test lots of aspects of people's visual perception and cognition. And so can you demonstrate that spending lots of time learning to draw has a measurable impact? And if so, on what aspects of vision? And so there are plenty of batteries of tests that you can administer to people, tapping aspects of different aspects of vision. And what we did over the course of many years and many studies was to look at some of these kind of tasks and figure out, where are there differences between artists and non-artists? So for instance, in my first paper on this, one of the things that artists were better at than non-artists was identifying the subject of photographs that were out of focus. So you just show a picture, something is in there, you can't quite tell, or maybe you can if you're an artist. Nothing to do with drawing, you're not copying the image or anything like that, but artists were reliably better at identifying what was in these pictures than non-artists were. And the fact that it didn't have anything directly to do with drawing was interesting. This is a relatively high-level visual decision, right? Object identification. There's lots of processing along the way that, could throw things one way or the other. And so, myself, but also other researchers in lots of different places looked at this, and the basic picture that emerges is that for very low-level aspects of vision, you don't see any real advantages. But the farther along you get in terms of processing within the brain, basically, differences become more and more apparent. And I think for the study that you cited, what we found was if you look at art students right as they come through the door, basically, within the first few weeks of college level intensive drawing training, they are already better than non-artists in some respects. They're not any better in some other respects. And what you see if you follow them through their first year with an intensive drawing foundations course. This is at the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, which is a very highly regarded art and design school with a very rigorous first year program. Interestingly, the same tasks where the artists already show an advantage, those are exactly the same tasks where they continue to show improvement. And so that's especially interesting because you would think that maybe if they were already good, that they were already at ceiling, they were already maxed out in what they were able to do. But it seems like, we're able to document almost in real time over the course of a couple of semesters what kind of changes happen in their processing. And these tasks, many of them are not just, self-report tasks or, attitude kind of tasks. These are, actual performance-based measures, so you can, you can't cheat at them. You do as well as you can, and you can see that you can do better and better. So this line of work that I've done, largely these days with Jennifer Drake, my colleague at Brooklyn College, and also Rebecca Chamberlain in London. This continues to move along, and it's interesting. But for me, it's really a separate kind of question, at least for me up till now, than the creativity question.
Oh, you mean the question of learning how to draw in the first 2 years of Pratt?
Yeah, we've looked at those data mainly from the standpoint of what are these sort of visual changes that happen in tasks that have very little to do with visual creativity. And
Oh,
it would be a straightforward extension to bring in some of those tasks, but that's not a step we've taken in any great depth so far. And the question also of how that translates. I mean, I've kept them as separate strands of my research, but I think there are legit theoretical reasons why you might think it might have a broader impact. So, for instance, one of the characteristics of artists' perception as they develop it is much greater attentional flexibility. So they're able to, zoom in and zoom out and shift their attention around in ways that non-artists find more difficult. And there are a lot of accounts of creativity that, speak exactly to those points as well. That, depending on what aspects of a problem situation you might be focusing on or what, parts of representation, that will lead in different creative directions. And so I think there's a nice connection there between some lower level perceptual processes and some of these higher level creative decisions. Having the flexibility lower down may open up possibilities that you simply literally wouldn't see at this higher level otherwise.
is there some way you could connect that to, I don't know, everyday life? So people who are listening to this, how could they translate your discoveries into their own creative life?
Tricky question. I think that this sense of creativity as rooted largely in perceptual experience is important. And I think that a lot of the research that is done these days, where you use, kind of simplified tasks that are mostly about idea generation, sometimes those have perceptual components, but sometimes they do not. And I think that exposure to lots of different kinds of stimuli, or even just paying attention to things in the way that you need to pay attention when you're drawing, you simply notice a lot more. I mean, the visual world is so complex. I mean, I'm looking out my window, I see this, shrubbery out there. And I'm kind of mesmerized at the moment just by the filigree detail and the way that the forms overlap, and getting lost in that kind of thing, and letting the chain of associations go. I think that's a very central kind of mental activity, and it's nice to be able to cultivate that. And the irony is that it needs to be done in a way that is not too forced. And so I think this notion of daydreaming, or letting your default mode network just kind of do its thing, you're not thinking of anything in particular, that there's a lot to be said for just having that experience and letting it connect with whatever else is going on in your mind. So I think this practice of realistic drawing, or trying to draw what you see, which sort of went out of fashion some decades ago as art training, or certainly as a required part of artistic training, that just trying that is itself very revealing. And I think it cultivates this awareness of the the visible world, let's say. that you can really, run with in interesting ways. And it doesn't have to be a slog. It doesn't have to be forced. You may or may not actually end up doing something with it. But, part of me thinks that it's being creative, is kind of overrated in terms of I need to have these achievements. That's a mindset, and I think if you are going to be at the top of your game, there has to be some of that. But I think a lot of the emphasis in research now on just experiential aspects of creativity, I think those are really important. I think, for a day-to-day perspective, maybe that's the most important thing you could do. It doesn't have to be, being creative doesn't have to be about, making this thing or, having this accomplishment. It's nice if it does, but, we can't all be Beethoven, and that can be okay too.
Yeah, a few minutes ago, you said something that you start without an idea and you wait for something to emerge. But then in that case, you don't know when it's going to happen or you don't know if it will happen. Whereas you've been sort of critical of more of an achievement mindset where you're always trying to go to a specific thing. But it sounds like you're describing a creative process where you're not supposed to have an endpoint, right? You're not supposed to know where you're going.
Right. And I think this is, again, sort of the problem that I have with overemphasizing ideas as a necessary starting point for the creative process. I don't think there is such a thing as an inherently good idea. So if you're waiting around for that to, pop into your head, well, settle in. And I think, one of the reasons that there are no inherently good ideas is that, most ideas are just incredibly abstract. They don't amount to anything. You can, spin the idea lots of different ways. And so it's important to recognize that you just shouldn't wait around. You can view an idea, the way have come to view ideas now is as something that really is the culmination of the creative process rather than the beginning. It's what you strive toward articulating in some form, but it's supported by this mass of all these other interacting ideas and experiences. And if you're making, a piece of visual art, if I get the feeling that if you create something that's really, really good, the idea itself is instantiated by the entire work. It's not, you can just pull out, oh, that's what the artist was going for, and you nutshell this in a kind of, insultingly oversimplified way. Part of what's useful is the richness of what is produced, the complexity of what is produced. And if you, are able to take that and distill it into some usable form so that someone else in the culture can take advantage of it, that's fine. But my sense is, if we're really talking about high-level creative achievements, they're very hard to capture by, any idea, any articulated idea. And I certainly don't think that, it's usually the case that what you end up with at the end of the process was what you would have predicted you would end up with. And if you are, then I think you're not challenging yourself enough. That it's a much more fun and interesting path, and it leads to better outcomes if you are able to roll with it. And that doesn't mean that you are not critical, you're not evaluating, but it frames the whole creative process in a very different way. If you don't think that you have to rely on an initial idea, you can accumulate lots of ideas, let them fight it out, and take a lot more care in just thinking through what are the implications, is this working, the sense of, evaluation, and like I said, even a kind of wisdom about making something that if you are just, hey, I got my great idea, now I'm on autopilot, you're not going to cultivate. I mean, that to me is a recipe for burnout, even if you manage by luck or whatever to get one or two nice conceptual innovations along the way. And so I think our expectations about what the creative process should be like and what we should be focused on if we want to make creative stuff, I think these are very different paths, and I think one is much more common in the literature than the other. Again, like the focus is usually on ideas and generating ideas rather than on finding ways to develop those ideas in ways that are interesting.
Right. My own research, I found exactly the same thing. I'm always emphasizing this wandering, iterative process and improvisational process. And when I interview
Right.
artists and designers myself, that's what they say. That's what they say. And that's what they say they're teaching their students. So, oh, by the way, for our listeners who might not know, that Pratt is in New York City and you at Brooklyn College, you're in New York City. So you're taking the subway over to
It's surprisingly hard to get to, but yes,
oh, you have to take more than one subway line to get there.
don't get me started.
No, I don't, actually I don't know. I don't know where Brooklyn College is, but I know where Brooklyn is.
Right.
So, but yeah, I mean, you're right there in New York. You're surrounded by these incredible creators. I mean, I think it's fair to say one of, if not the creative center for the United States. And
Right.
you haven't stopped with the artists and painters and illustrators. You've done studies of jazz musicians and classical musicians and composers. I wanted to ask you about your study with jazz musicians because that's been a lot of my own research, improvisation. And fairly recently, you did a study of just this incredible number, 921 jazz artists. So how did you, in 17,000 jazz albums? So how do you do that? How do you study such volumes? And not, okay, I guess I should ask, what's the take home message? What do you learn from doing that? And
Well,
then
so
how do you do that?
So credit where credit is due. On the recent jazz study, this was almost entirely the work of my co-author. And I was brought on relatively late. He's someone I knew in grad school. And I think the reason for that was that I had done this other work years back on issues of lifespan creativity. So both of these studies, the old classical ones that I did and the more recent jazz study, are really about how creativity unfolds over the lifespan and whether you can have meaningful differences in people's creative trajectories and how to make sense of it. And so I think the upshot, certainly of the earlier work, was really focused on these questions of creative longevity. And part of it was the question of, can musicians learn to more wisely invest their creative resources? So there's a really basic question that I think Dean Simonton, very eminent creativity researcher, was onto this question a long time ago, which is, basically how controllable is the creative process? And in his classic model, it's called the blind variation and selective retention model. It's very Darwinian. It's very rooted in the idea of chance. So if the process of idea generation is a chance process, right? Lots of combinations of things in your head, that's not controllable. The creative process itself in this model is so complicated that you can't meaningfully control that either. And once you finish something and put it out in the world, an album, a symphony, whatever, it's out of your hands. People are going to make their judgments. Experts, gatekeepers are going to, render their verdicts. And so that part of creativity is also not controllable. And so when you think about a model like this, it's like, good grief. Is it really the case that no one, learns to get any better? Or, what's going on here? Is that model really accurate? And so one of the studies going back a long time now, that he had done looked at classical composers, and he calculated a statistic called hit ratio. So for each chunk of a composer's career, basically how much music did they write and what fraction of that music was masterpiece level. And if it really is the case that there is no control of the creative process, then that ratio, that hit ratio, should not really change systematically with age. Some people will be, higher than others, but there's not going to be a consistent trend in people, like I said, learning to invest their creative resources more wisely and increasing their hit ratio over age. And he had a few studies that were, very large studies for the time. And this is back in punch card days when you would do, your computer analyses the old-fashioned way. When I got into this, the tech had improved a bit, but, in a lot of these studies, one of them that I looked at with 65 composers, over 15,000 pieces of music. And this is before Spotify. There used to be these things called CD stores where you'd go in and they would sell you music on CDs, but you could check the timing, for instance, of different pieces or, stuff that I didn't have in my own collection. And so I logged all of this stuff essentially by hand and then put it into these fancy statistical models. Nowadays, there's a lot more stuff online, and so it is not quite as onerous to do these big data studies. But what we find in a lot of these studies is that the initial conclusions that hit ratio doesn't change with age, that people don't learn to invest their creative resources more wisely. That seems not to be the case. Classical composers, at least, I know this data set a lot better. You find the usual hallmarks of productivity starting low, increasing till about age 40, and then trailing off thereafter. For something like hit ratio, it also changes with age. And so, great composers are peaking in their early 50s, and then it's a shallower trailing off. So you get the same kind of shape. And the key thing is that it is simply not flat, that there's evidence that for at least the very greatest composers, on average, many of them are increasing the quality of the work, the proportion of great works that they're writing to total works. They're doing this over, decades and decades. And it's not true for everybody. Stravinsky, for instance, writes his best stuff by the time he's 30. He continues writing lots of stuff, some of it great, but, he's basically on a Picasso downward trajectory for a large part of his later career. Whereas you have other composers, Haydn, Verdi, Brahms, Dvorak, Beethoven, who just get better and better with age. And so the fact that those kinds of data come out, and there are, similar patterns in some of the jazz data where you have, late works being more highly regarded among many jazz musicians. You have this picture that, well, maybe it isn't all chance. Maybe there is something to be learned. Maybe there is a way to, harness your knowledge and wisdom and skill to produce work that is consistently getting better and better. And I think this is another angle on a corrective to the stereotypical view of creativity that, it's got to be original, it's got to be brand new, or it doesn't count. I mean, that is just a false dichotomy. Most creative work follows very clearly and closely on the tradition that gave rise to it in the first place. Completely original ideas will be completely incomprehensible. It's a nice story to tell that you can, come up with something brand new that everybody, is sort of awed by. But I think that is a misconstrual of how creativity usually operates, and that instead of striving for radical novelty at all costs by rejecting tradition, that this alternative of, let's see what works and build on tradition, and try to learn to, just do good work and not worry about it being super original for the moment. That I think this more accurately captures a lot of real findings about creativity in studies that probe these questions carefully. And I think it is it's a real kind of reset on what we should be thinking about the creative process being like, and what the prospects might be for engaging with it, and taking some time to not worry about being super original all the time, but cultivating some different kinds of sensibilities about creative engagement. And so I think it's an exciting time to be working with this set of ideas and the results and what they mean, both for understanding high level achievement creativity, but there's an ethos that trickles down, I think, to lots of aspects of everyday creativity that people can find really fulfilling, even if they don't aspire to be eminent creators in their own right. So I think there's a lot of cool stuff mixed in with all that.
I like something you just said, which is just do good work. Don't worry
Right.
about
Yeah.
whether it's original or earth changing. Just do good work and good things will come out of it.
Yeah, and I think there's an aspect of doing work that's seems really trendy and cutting edge, and 20 years later is just like, oh, such an obvious period piece. I know exactly what they were trying to do, and they failed because they didn't have the foundation to do something a little more enduring. And so yeah, I think that's an underrated aspect of how people think about creative problems.
Right, right. Yeah, I hate to focus on anything negative in my podcast, but I'm thinking about a book that was very influential for me by Howard Becker. It's called Art Worlds, which is a book about artists and art making and the art worlds. And he tells the story of going into an art school, and the art schools will have books that they keep from every year of their Masters of Fine Art students. They have a big exhibition at the end, and they all do it together, and it's at the museum, and all the professors go through, and it's a really big deal. And they publish a book which has the works by all of these Master of Fine Art students. So he talks about looking at them 40 years ago and 30 years ago. And he says every year, when you look at 40 years ago, they all look almost like the same painting. It's like all the
Right, right.
students look like they're copying each other. But when you're
Yeah.
there, like if you went to one of those shows right now, you would see all the differences. You would see the variety. But then you think 40 years from now, is everybody going to look at this and think, they're all kind of the same? So you can't approach creative work with that attitude in your head, like whatever I do, it doesn't matter. It's all gonna.
Right, right, right.
Um,
Well, I think that your point, that's a terrific story. I think it really speaks to the importance of the test of time as well. Certainly for the establishment of creative reputations, or the development of works that are considered canonical. And I think the tricky thing is that when you're making something in real time, you don't really have the full test of time available to you. You have to go based just with, whatever you're working on. And so this sense of, sensitivity to, well, what is trendy, and is this likely to be, a fad, or, no, there's really something there, absorbing quality work from the past as some form of grounding, just to know what is possible. I think these are important distinctions, and I think the best you can do is to build in a little bit of the test of time yourself. I mean, this is one of the things I discovered doing drawing and painting. I guess we're coming full circle now, but you work on something and then you put it away. You like turn it to the wall. You don't look at it for weeks or months. And there's this magical moment where you turn it around and you're like, oh, that part's terrible. That part's good. All of the noise has just washed away, and it becomes clearer to ascertain what the direction is. And I feel like if you are constantly type A personalitying through, I got to do this, I got to do that, then this is deeply antithetical to making coherent sense of whatever creative enterprise you are working in. And that it's okay to take your time and be slow. I'd rather do one good painting that took 10 months than do 10 terrible paintings, each of which took 1 month. And so that sense of letting time work for you instead of working against the clock is, I think, another aspect of this creative dynamic. And so, there are no guarantees. Obviously, you might spend a lot of time and it's still terrible, but, I think you increase your odds by taking your time and letting the experience happen in lots of different ways and lots of different settings. So
Yeah, that's a great lesson is just do the work, just do your best, do the work. We're ending, we're reaching the end of our time, and I always like to ask guests if you have some practical tips or an exercise or something, some advice you could give to our listeners, something they can do in the next week, let's say, that might enhance their creativity.
So you warned me that you were going to ask this question, which I appreciate. So I gave it some thought. I guess that some tangential answers have already come up.
Yeah,
Looking at the
absolutely.
shrubbery, drawing, and everything. But the official answer that came to mind when I thought about well, what would I say, really relates more to this everyday experience of just kind of immersion in the past. So, what I would recommend is take some time, find a quiet, dark room, close your eyes, and listen to some Bach, because that will cleanse you in a way aesthetically and creatively. I think that is very valuable. This sense of knowing, what is creatively possible, that you can produce transcendent work, thinking of like the Goldberg variations, for instance, that has lots of originality, creativity, but it's done in subtle ways that doesn't beat you over the head. And you can listen to it 1,000 times and always get something new. And I think it's very informative and salutary to remember that there are such creative artifacts, that it doesn't have to be the frenetic everyday instantiations of novelty, or something trying to grab your attention, but that there are these things that somehow a member of our species produced, that for hundreds of years at least will provoke a sense of creative gratitude. And I think that that is an important step. So, you may not come out of it writing your own preludes and fugues, but, Bach's got that handled. It's fine. It's enough to have that moment, and I think get into a mindset where you're, reminded of those qualities and receptive to what is in the world around you. And then if something happens from that, great. But at the very least, you've had hopefully a super high quality transcendent experience. And frankly, if that's all you get out of creativity in your life, you're probably doing really well. And so if more than that happens, great. But the good stuff is really good stuff, and don't forget it.
Well, Aaron, thank you so much. It's been a great conversation, and I really enjoyed the conversation.
Delighted to be here. Thank you so much for having me, Keith.
I really enjoyed that conversation with Dr. Aaron Kozbelt. I wanted to talk to him just about a lot more things. I had a lot more questions I prepared in a Microsoft Word document. In particular, I wanted to ask him about the painting on the wall behind him. He said early in the interview that was one of his paintings, and very humble that he didn't even start talking about the painting. If you enjoyed our conversation and the episode, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the show, leave a comment, tell your friends about it, share the episode, and keep coming back to the science of creativity.